Hi everyone, I'm Jonathan Hall, and today I'm going to do another Go Code Roast. What's a Go Code Roast? I'm going to review some code as though I was considering it for a job application. I've done a couple of these before. I'll have some links in the description below, or you could probably click on one of these cards. But today's code I haven't seen yet, so you're going to be seeing my reaction as I go through it for the first time. And I'll spend about a half an hour maybe talking about what I like, what I don't like, and where I think maybe things could be improved, and just my general thoughts and impressions on the code. So let's get started. All right, here's the repo I will be looking at. It's called Go Around, a tool to query Stack Overflow via terminal. All right, there's a little animated demo here, I guess, or not. It's animated, but oh, there it does something. Okay. So I guess it's a Stack Overflow browser of sorts for a console. That's kind of interesting. Usage here, we can call go around search, search for your thing. A few environment variables are supported to set API key. Didn't even know they had an API with available public keys, but that's cool. Set a page size and so on. All right. There's a description of the two variables. You can set, again, the API key. Let me zoom in a little bit here to make this easier for you to see. One of the challenges with these videos, of course, is trying to zoom in enough that you can see, especially if you're looking on a mobile device, but not so far that it's impractical to use the screen. Yeah, it looks like that's about as far as I can go on GitHub. So okay, I'm gonna start looking at the code here. I may change zoom levels as we go along. So first thoughts, the README is nice. I haven't tried using the tool yet, but the README appears to have pretty good documentation. Explains the environment variable. So kudos on a good README. There's a license file that's important for open source, although it looks like it's empty. So that's going to be a problem, I expect, if you try to read the Go doc for this, because the Go doc will really only try to show you packages with a acceptable open source license. So let's just verify that here. If I search for the package name, I'm guessing it's going to tell us it's not available. That's interesting. Actually, I wonder if that's because there's no Go code in the... No, there's a main.go, so it should show up there. Hi, future me here. As I was watching the edited video, I realized why the Go doc doesn't show up on this website. Let me show you. If we look at the go.mod file, this Go module is called Go Around, which is not a valid module name. So that's the problem. This should say github.com/glendsoza/go around, and then it would show up properly in GoDoc if the license file is done correctly. So enough of that confusion. Let's get back to the main video. I always like to start by looking at go.mod. Actually, I started with the README, but go.mod is a good next step because it gives me a nice high-level overview of the package. So here I can see this is intended to work with Go 1.17, which is as I record this is 2 versions old. 1.19 is out now. And there's only 3 top-level dependencies, and I'm not familiar with any of them except XNet. And I can see that below that, for indirect dependencies, there's a few packages I am familiar with, Cobra and pfFlag, for example, sys term. That makes sense since this is a terminal-based tool. So yeah, I don't really know anything about this GDAmore T-cell or Revo TView, but they apparently are related to terminal interaction. So yeah, let's get going. Let's look at main.go. Nice entry point to the program. This is our main package, and it does almost nothing, which is nice. I like a main package that's empty or nearly empty, and a main function in particular. One reason I like an empty or nearly empty, you can't have a literally empty main function if you want your program to do something, but one reason I like a main function that's nearly empty is you can't test a main function with a Go test suite. it's impossible to call main, and you can't give it any arguments or anything like that. So even if you could, what would you be testing? So it's really good practice if you're writing anything more than a throwaway program. It's good practice for your main package to call something else that you can test properly. So this is using the Cobra, I believe. We'll dig into this, but I believe it's calling Cobra's CMD package. So we'll look at that and see what it's doing. One thing I don't like here is the relative import. It's actually really bad practice in Go to use relative imports. This should have the full path name to the import. The fact that relative imports work sometimes is kind of almost an accident, I guess. So just best practice to never use relative imports in Go. They aren't properly supported and they don't always work in all cases. So this should have github.com/blah, blah, blah, the full import path. Let's get going into there. That was in CMD. And wait, was it? Did I remember incorrectly? It was 2 levels, wasn't it? Oh, I think that's right. Let me just double check. Go around CMD. Okay. So I don't know which one it's using. Probably root. Let's look at that one. Nice little boilerplate here. That should be updated or removed. The fact that there's no blank space between that and the PKG thing, and the PKG line, means that this is considered part of the Go doc, which it probably shouldn't be, especially if it's in every file. Yeah, it's in every file. So if the Go doc were working, I think this would be very confusing. I think it'd have duplicated copyright notices that aren't actually doing anything. So I would suggest cleaning that up, either removing that entirely, since there's apparently no license here anyway, or at minimum putting an extra blank line in there. If you want a copyright notice at the top of each file, that's fine, but you need to have a blank line then between that and your package line, or your Go doc is going to be a little bit confused. Not a big deal. We still haven't looked at anything functional yet, so let's keep going here. All right. So here is the execute command that we saw, or execute function we saw being executed from our main function. So here's where things actually happen. And it just calls root CMD, which is defined here. Not a whole lot going on here just yet. By the way, since we're talking about this Cobra tool, Cobra is a very popular tool to build command line tools in Go. I've used it on a number of projects, and I more or less like it. There are some things that I think are a little bit iffy about it, but for the most part, it's a really good package. But it does use a lot of global state, which I don't like. You don't have to use it that way. You don't have to use a globally defined root CMD, for example, or a global execute function. So I prefer not to use the globals, just because I think global state is messy and it makes testing harder. I wouldn't hold that against this person. If this was a job application, I wouldn't hold that against them, because there are times when maybe it's appropriate to use global state. It's certainly easier in certain circumstances, and this might be one of those. But just to be aware, if you're using the Cobra library, you don't have to use the global state. On oddity I see here is the difference in quotation marks. We see the double quotes here and then the back quotes for the second line. I'm not sure why that is. I suppose the reason is because the long description might have multiple lines that would you wouldn't want to have to use the \n, but it's not obviously being used in this case. Not a problem, just something that kind of makes me scratch my head a little bit. Still looking for the root of something going on. So here we have a command called command. So we have a command called command, I guess. It's a little bit confusing. I'm not sure what that means or why a command would be called command. Here's the run function in line. This looks like boilerplate code that was just left over from an example somewhere, perhaps. Probably from the Cobra documentation. So one thing I don't like here is that the run command is inline. I would much rather have that be a separate function so that it can be tested. Now, one thing I haven't looked at yet is if there's even any unit tests in this package at all. To check that, I'm going to actually check this out locally on my local machine. So let me get that started here. All right, let's see how many tests, if any, we have here. No tests at all. So there's a red flag. I would like to have tests. If this was a job application, I would definitely be asking the candidate why there aren't tests. Because if we're writing code for production, we want tests on it. I mean, if it's worth writing, if it's worth delivering to the customer, it's worth making sure it works. So there should definitely be tests if this is production code. Let's keep examining this here. Oh, search is the other command I want to look at. I think that's a separate command. Yes, the search command. Okay. So once again, the run is inline. It should be a separate function probably. Although in this case, it's a very, very simple function. It just calls UI.run, which we'll look at in a moment, I guess. And if it gets an error, it does log.fatal. I'm not a fan of log.fatal. I've written a blog post about this. I'll put a link in the description if you're interested in my thoughts on that. I don't like the idea of coupling logging with flow control. I think that's an anti-pattern. It's not a terrible red flag. I would call it a yellow flag here. It's not a big red flag on a CLI tool where you generally exit at the same time that you log the error. But for a server or anything like that, it's definitely a red flag. But let's look at this UI.run and see what it does. So it initializes a UI manager. I don't know what that is exactly, except that, I guess we'll find out, but it must, I don't know. It's a little bit of a confusing interface here, but okay, so it initiates a manager, sets the query from the parameters, sets tags, okay, and then it runs. All right, let's see what this manager is. Renders all other widgets. Okay, and it looks like there's different widget types associated with it. Net question widget, and net loading widget. I guess that's WD means widget. Or widget display, I don't know exactly. Init form widget. Okay, I think WD just means widget because I see it being used somewhat interchangeably, it looks like here. That's fine. So I have a little bit of a concern here. It looks like we are, maybe it's necessary, but it looks like we're initializing all the widgets in all cases. And I don't know yet if that's actually necessary. I would expect that we only initialize the widgets we need for any given operation. But maybe they're all needed. I'm not sure yet. I'm not a fan of these 3-letter variable names or field names. Yeah, I'm not a fan. I would rather this be called question, answer, loading, form, and wrapper, for example. If you want to put the WD or widget in the struct field name as well, that's fine. But variable names are free. Struct names are free. You might as well make them as descriptive as possible. What else? Set answer input capture. So here we're capturing, I guess, inputs. And this is doing it specifically on AWD, which I have to go look and see what that is again. Answer widget. That's why a longer name would be useful. So I have some questions about the architecture and structure of this code. Having these unexported functions on the manager type that only do something with one of the members makes me think that these should be methods on those fields. So in other words, set answer input capture. Why isn't that just called set input capture as a method on the answer widget? There may be a valid reason, but it's not obvious to me why. So this isn't very obviously, it's not obvious code at this point. I'm not saying it's wrong. Just it's hard for me to understand why that's happening. But still, I'm looking at this at a very high level. I don't think this scope is necessary. It just adds unnecessary indentation. I would remove that. Here we launch a couple Go routines. It says we're waiting. For questionable, I don't see any waiting happening. I think this function is mislabeled, misnamed. There's nothing here that will cause it to wait. I would. It looks to me more like this is about. Well, maybe there's a callback. Render question is apparently a callback. Still, calling it wait isn't quite right because I mean that implies to me that this function blocks until something happens, but it doesn't. It just calls two Go routines and returns immediately. However, it does look like it calls this after the load has happened. So it's like a deferred or a callback. It's sort of a JavaScript. This pattern is common in JavaScript. There's nothing wrong with it in Go per se, but the name is confusing. What else can we say here? Set selected question handler. I think I need to look at some of these like answer and question widgets to get a better sense of what's going on in some of these cases. So I will do that in just a moment. Okay, so this looks like where we launch everything. We call question input capture, set answer input capture. So it looks like we are using a number of those widgets. This can be simplified. You can just say return right here and skip this if. There's no point in checking for nil if you're just going to return anyway. Returning error unconditionally is the same, or in other words, is returning the value of this function. Not a problem. It just makes the code a little bit shorter and easier to read. Okay, let's dive into some of these widgets. Let's do, I don't know. Let's just start with the first one, I guess. Maybe this question widget. See if we can make heads or tails of what it's doing. So we can set a query, set tags, get query just returns query. Okay. Small note here in Go, it is considered unnecessary to prefix your getters with the word get. There's no reason not to just say query here. It's sort of Go standard. Further, I don't see any reason for getters and setters here at all unless the purpose is to satisfy an interface. I don't think that is the case here. I don't see evidence of that. But why not just export this query field, and then you can just get it and set it using equality, the equal sign. Maybe the same for tags. One reason not to do that, by the way, would be if this is meant to be concurrency safe and you need a mutex around it, but I don't see that happening. So I don't see any reason for getters or setters here at all. I would just make that an exported field, or maybe the tags also, make them both exported. If you do want the getters and setters, just remove the word get from your getter. So here we return the new question widget, which instantiates this tview new list, creates a map, an empty map, and sets a couple blanks values, which are these strings. I don't like the unnamed field references here. If you have a struct that has only one or maybe two fields in it, this is fine. But beyond that, it's hard to read. I mean, I was just looking at the struct definition up here 30 seconds ago, and I'm down here in the constructor, and I already don't remember what order the struct fields are in. Further, if any of these ever change order, then this will be invalidated. Suppose somebody moved query to after tags or something, then it would just be wrong. So better to use the full syntax here and explicitly mention the field names for each of the 4 fields. It does make your code a little bit longer, but more readable, which is more important than length in my view. Populate. So it looks like this populates a question widget. I'm guessing this reads from the API. Yes, it calls search on the API. And if there is an error, then it adds an item. I guess it's some sort of queue or message queue. I'm not sure exactly. Indicates it passes the value 1 to the done channel and then returns. I'm really curious how that done channel is used and why passing the value 1 is necessary. I don't think it is. I don't remember where we saw that. Was that in the previous file? So dunchan is a value int. So here's where it's used. I don't think there's any reason to use integers there, but let's keep going and see. I think so. A done channel usually is only meaningful. Usually, it's not. You don't pass data on a done channel. There are times when you might, but usually when it's called done, it just means that you're just looking for closed. So I wouldn't be passing integers on it. And if you're passing integers, I hope they mean something. And it's certainly not clear at all what 1 means. Is 1 distinct from 0 or from 12 or a billion? So it's confusing. So this is something I would definitely change. This is a code smell. If 1 is actually significant, this should be made a constant in my view that describes what it's for. Maybe 1 is success and 0 is failure or something like that, for example. In which case I would create a constant called done success and done failure and give them those values, and then it would be clear what's being passed. What I suspect is actually happening though is that we're just passing a flag that says this has happened. And if that's the case, it probably shouldn't be an integer at all. It should probably be a blank struct, a struct with no values in it. A struct with no values in it takes up 0 memory, even if you have 1,000,000 instances of it. So it's a nice little memory trick. Now, of course, if you're using an integer here, it looks like this is only being used maybe 1 instance of that integer at a time. So you're going to be using like 4 bytes probably, or maybe 8 bytes. It's just a few bytes of memory, not a big deal. My bigger concern here is the semantic meaning of 1. It's not clear to me what 1 means, and I shouldn't have to read this code and be thinking, what is that? So if the 1 is actually necessary, give it a constant with a descriptive name, so it's obvious that I'm sending to the done channel something of significance. If it doesn't have significance, then replace it with either close done channel, just to indicate that you're done, or use an empty struct to indicate that I'm not passing data. I'm just passing a signal that there's something has happened on the channel. I hope that makes sense. Let's continue. All right, so here we render. So it looks like this works without the app key. That's interesting. So you can do it with or without the key. Interesting. Yeah, okay. Let's go back. Let's look at the next widget in the list. This is the answer widget. I think it's working. So we have an answer cache, just an in-memory map, integer to an answer result. I'm supposing that integer is an ID of some sort. I would prefer not to see this as a package variable, but as an instance variable. It probably doesn't matter in this case, but just good practice is to make that I would make this an instance of this answered widget. That way, if you have multiple instances simultaneously in memory, they're not going to clobber each other. Maybe you have one talking to StackOverflow and one talking to meta.StackOverflow, for example, and you wouldn't want those to clobber each other. And also for the purpose of testing, if you write tests, which there aren't any in this package, but good practice would be to write tests. And if you have these this cache as a package variable, then you can generally you can only run one test at a time. If you make them instance variables, then you could make an arbitrary number of instances and test them all simultaneously in parallel for much faster test results. So those are just a couple of reasons why globals, or in this case a package variable, is something I would look down upon. I would encourage not doing it that way. What else can we do here? Initialize template. I'm curious where this is called from. It's called from here. That's good. My concern was that this might be called more than once, but I see it. It looks like it's only being called on initialization, which is a good thing. Where did the utils come from? It's our own package. So that's something I don't like. I don't like packages called utils because it doesn't tell me what they're doing. Now here I can see that we have some at least 2 templating functions in that utils package. Why not call it templating, or at least template utils? At least then I know what it is. I'll look at that package in a minute and see if there's anything else in there. But I really like descriptive package names and utils, helpers. You might as well just call it code. I mean, if you think about it, all code is a utility, has utility, or else it wouldn't exist, right? All code helps, or it wouldn't exist. So names like that, I just consider like they're non-names. You might as well call it stuff. So give it a better name, ideally. What else? I would invert this. Not a big deal. I would change the sense of this, and if instead of saying if not okay, I would say if okay, return data nil, and then the rest of this can be unindented. And it would make absolutely no difference otherwise, because you can see that the return is already duplicated. If this line wasn't here, then there's a slight reason you might want to do it this way, but still, I would prefer having the duplicated return and unindent this. And it's not the indentation per se that is a problem. I mean, this is only 2 levels of indentation. It's not a big deal. The bigger reason to unindent your code like this is it makes the cognitive load easier. What I mean by that is when you're reading through this code, as it stands right now, I have to keep in my head, okay, here's a not, if not okay, but I can see just kind of without even moving my eyes, I can see that at the bottom, there's another situation where I might have what's the okay situation? Now this is a short enough function, it's not a big deal, but suppose it was like this and it's just a little bit longer and I can't see the end of that. I have to keep in my head all the while I'm looking at this and trying to sort of keep that little piece of information in my head that there's another case I have to think about. If you switch this around and make this if okay and return early, then just cognitively as I'm reading through this, I'm like, oh, okay, I've already handled that case. I can stop. I can ignore the rest of that. I don't have to think about it anymore. I'm only worried about one case now. So that's the bigger reason. It's not the indentation per se that matters. It's the cognitive burden as you're reading through the code. How many pieces of information do you have to keep juggling as you're trying to think through your through the logic? So it will be a really simple change. It's not a huge deal, but it would be a very simple change to improve the cognitive burden of reading this code. Here we have the done channel with an int again. So see my previous comments, exact same comments there. I should verify what that's doing, because I'm really curious what's reading that done channel. It's passed into populate and load. We have the same here. Okay, so every time it receives a value, it calls update draw. So it's not good enough to close it, but it would be good enough, I believe, to just pass an empty struct. So I would change that. Again, it's more semantically clear what's happening. If you pass an empty struct value, there's no question what does it mean, because we know that it means nothing. The fact that you're passing an integer makes it unclear. Does 1 mean something distinct from 2 or 7 or 0? And I want to look at that utils package. Go back to the top level here. Get date diff helper function to get the difference between Unix date and current date and number of days. I don't understand what that means. So the first thing I noticed is that the godoc comment doesn't match the proper format. You should generally use the proper format, which is to start your comment with the name of the function and then explain what it does. So this one should be get date diff in days, returns the difference between Unix date and current date in number of days. Although I'm honestly, I don't even know what that means. This could be clarified and made more clear. The fact that it's used in an answer template, that's useful. That suggests that most of these are used as templating. We know this one is function to generate separator string or answer. Yeah. So all of these functions are used as template functions. So that suggests the name. Call them template funcs, for example, or template utils. That would be a much clearer name. I wouldn't ever wonder what utils is. And then further, if this library is ever extended, and somebody, maybe another person's adding some functionality to it, they're not going to be tempted to put unrelated code in this package called utils. That's the other problem with packages like utils and helpers, is they just sort of become a dustbin for all sorts of random nonsense. So would rename that. Here we go through HTML. This code needs tests. Just from experience, I've done enough of this. I know that it's tricky to do HTML parsing and manipulation correctly. This needs tests to make sure it's done correctly. All right, I've been looking at this code for a while. I think I've got a pretty high-level view. Let's go through some pros and cons and wrap this thing up. So pros, great README. I like that. I like that you have very few dependencies. That's great. Just 3 top-level dependencies, and they're kind of necessary ones because they relate to the use of screen manipulation. Actually, as I say this, I think that some of these should be top-level dependencies. Like I think Cobra should be a direct dependency. I'm going to find out here. That's the only one that's missing. So your Go mod is outdated, but that's not a big deal. Cobra should be a direct dependency rather than indirect, but I wouldn't hold that against a job applicant. The big red flags here: no tests at all. That would be a problem that would come up definitely in a technical interview if I was reviewing this for a job application. And then a number of stylistic things, reduced indentation, invert ordering of things. The global and package variables are a smell. Overall, I think this is reasonably good code. I haven't executed it except to run the tests, which weren't there. But it's also fairly, screen manipulation, HTML parsing and manipulation. There's a number of kind of icky things in here that there's just not a super clean way. This isn't perfectly obvious code. So, it makes sense that there's a little bit of nuance and a little bit of messiness, so to speak, here. I do have some questions about the structure of the widgets, the way those are handled. I don't have an obvious suggestion for an alternative just yet. I wouldn't hold that against somebody in a job application either. Oh, here as I'm talking, I dove into the API package. It looks like this is sort of custom written API logic. That's kind of impressive. I would love to spend more time looking at some of this. Here's a problem. The error is ignored here. You should never ignore an error. If you get back a response that's either invalid JSON or the JSON response doesn't match the expected format, that error is going to be ignored. So that's a red flag right there. It's easy to fix. Just add an error equals, and then if the error is not nil, return it. So it wouldn't be hard to fix that, but that's a red flag. All right, I'm going to wrap up here. Thank you. Let me give proper thanks to the author of this code. So I don't actually know your name, but your GitHub handle is glendsoza. Thank you so much for submitting your code. It takes a certain amount of courage to do that, to let somebody else critique this code you've written, especially publicly. I hope you've learned something from this. I hope all of you have learned something. If you have some code you would like me to review in the future, leave a comment below. I would love to hear from you, and maybe I'll roast your code in an upcoming video. Until next time, boldly go.